Hi there. If you're watching this on YouTube, or you're wanting to watch any of my content on my channel, or both for that matter, I would strongly recommend hitting the subscribe button and comment and like on any videos if you may wish, because this is a general audience channel. Also, this video is not made for kids, it is for older fans and adults alike. So please sit back and enjoy the video. Warning. This video may be either dark, scary, or intense, or all the above for younger viewers. It also may contain some storylines that are disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Zero. Based on the original story by Narrow Gauge and Ghost Train, the Untold Story of Timothy by Kane Taker Fan 701. Adapted, edited, and told by Julyleonard. One afternoon, Percy was bringing some trucks to Edward's station. It was a simple task, but he didn't mind. It had been a while since he last left Thomas's branch line, and he enjoyed seeing other sights of Sodor. He especially loves the viaduct that stretches across a huge valley with a calm and clean river below. It's a wonderful sight. Percy was also very fond of Edward and was looking forward to seeing him again. The feeling was mutual as the old engine smiled when he heard the little green engine's whistle. Percy brought his trucks into the station and Edward pulled up alongside him. "Hello, Percy," he said. "How are things been?" "Oh, very well, thank you," replied Percy cheerfully. "I've had good runs, and the trucks have been behaving." "Very good. And what about Thomas? Is he getting along all right?" "Oh, he's doing good. A bit of a handful sometimes," chuckled Percy. "Though I did put him in his place one time when I made him think I was a ghost." "A ghost?" laughed Edward. "Do tell." Percy explained the time he crashed into a cart of lime and was as white as a ghost. "It was just after I told him about the ghost of an engine who fell into a gap or something, and he called me a silly little engine." Edward's face suddenly darkened. "Into a gap, you say?" "Yes, though driver said it was a made-up one on television. It wasn't actually real." "Yes, well, I wouldn't say it was entirely made up," said Edward quietly. Percy was confused. "You mean driver did see a real ghost?" "Oh, no, that's not what I meant, Percy. I'm sure what your driver saw on television was a fictional story. But sometimes fiction can be based on truth. This engine that fell into a gap, I'm all too familiar with it. It's actually well known amongst those who know Sodor's history." "Well, what's it about?" asked Percy. "I can share it if you want, but I must warn you, it's not a pleasant tale." Percy thought. Edward wouldn't usually give a warning before telling a story, so he was feeling a little nervous. In the end, though, his curiosity got the better of him. "Please tell me," he finally said. "Very well," sighed Edward. And so he began. A long time ago, the island of Sodor consisted of several smaller railways that were disconnected from one another. Eventually, though, plans were made to have them all joined together as one, creating what we now know as the Fact Controllers Railway. This change included many developments, digging tunnels, forming new stations, and one in particular constructing a huge viaduct across the valley, which still stands today. To assist with all this, a tank engine was brought in from Brighton in the mainland to work on one of the smaller railways. This engine was unusual. It was a newly built E2 prototype, one of a kind, which looked very similar to Thomas, but with shorter side tanks, painted silver, with red lining, and a yellow number 0, and with freckles on his face. He was called Timothy. Now, Timothy wasn't a bad sort from what workers and engines have said. In fact, he was rather friendly and always eager to please. It was truly a shame, then, that he wasn't a very successful engine. Being an early prototype, Timothy came with many faults in his design that greatly hindered his performance. You know how Henry used to be before his rebuilt crew. It was like that, except that it wasn't his small firebox. Rather, Timothy lacked any real pulling power. He could pull trains and shunting trucks, but struggled greatly with heavier loads. For many of the other engines on the railway, it was seen as a great source for teasing and bullying. Timothy would often find himself in the corner as endless insults were thrown at him. "You keep to the sidings, weakling," the engine said. "Make way for the proper engines." Timothy never had the strength to fight back. He tried his best to be useful, but the constant workloads and constant berating from others made life harder than it already was. But there were a small handful of engines that stood by Timothy's side and gave as much support as possible, though it seemed to do no good. Then one fateful night, everything changed. There was an evening passenger train bound for the last station on the line, just before the valley, with the viaduct still being built. However, the engine scheduled for the train had broken down, and no one else was available, except for Timothy. There was much concern for many as Timothy backed down onto the coaches. He was determined, no matter the strain, he would ensure the train would reach the other end of the line. Once the guard blew his whistle, the driver called out from the cab, "Full steam ahead, Timothy." "Sure thing," Timothy replied, and huffed and puffed out of the station. Timothy was soon puffing down the countryside, with the rails humming and the coaches clattering behind him. The moon was full, the signals were down, and the wind was blowing gracefully. Not far from the last station, they approached a loop, where a goods train sat waiting. The engine stared in disbelief at Timothy and scowled at him. "Pathetic," it wheezed. "To think that you'd be worthy of a train like that. Do yourself a favor, weakling, and throw yourself off the line when you're done. We don't need engines like you." Soon they approached the last station, which came into view, and the driver applied the brakes. Nothing happened. The train merely sped past, startling all who stood on the platform. Now, no one is certain what happened next. Timothy's driver said that the regulator just stopped working and couldn't slow down in time. The goods engine claimed that when the insult was thrown, Timothy looked furious, almost enraged. Whatever the reason, the train began going faster and faster. The engine's wheels blurred, and the coaches rattled violently. "Timothy, what are you doing?" the driver called out. Timothy didn't answer. He just kept on going. Once they realized this, the guard slammed on the brakes in the brake coach. The only result was loud screeching wheels, firing huge sparks in all directions. The driver and fireman fought desperately for control, pressing harder on the regulator and brakes, but it was no use. All attempts were futile. Timothy didn't slow. In fact, he seemed to be going faster. He quickly sunk in where they were heading, and then something had changed that night inside Timothy. Something snapped. His eyes began to turn bright glowing red. Suddenly, they were heading now on a long stretch of line. At the end, much to the driver and fireman's horror, the valley. The valley came closer and closer. Workmen, who were on a night shift, ran to safety. The driver only saw one option. He grabbed a shunter's pole and thrusted it into the fireman's hands. "Quickly, get out there and uncouple the train." Any fear the fireman had was ignored as he clambered out of the cab and waddled on the running board. Holding onto the bunker, he reached down and tried to grab the chain with the pole. The engine nearly had him lose his footing and it seemed impossible to pull the chain. But he tried, over and over and over again. And then, "Got it!" he shouted as he lifted the chain off the hook. The coaches began trailing behind, and the crew leapt off the engine. As for Timothy, well, no one knew what he was thinking. No one got a chance, as he left the rails and plunged into the gap. Edward took a deep breath. He was so focused on his story, he hadn't really been looking at Percy. Not surprisingly, when he did, the little green engine was in shock. The passenger train thankfully stopped before reaching the end. Not one human was harmed. Rightfully so. The driver and fireman were dubbed heroes of the railway. They showed remarkable bravery in such a dire situation. But there wasn't much care for their engine, Timothy, though. Edward sighed. The remains were fished out and left in the yard. Some parts were salvageable, but otherwise, Timothy was lost. No one really seemed to care. By that point, some of their engines had already been bought or loaned. "And so the engine is now a ghost?" Percy asked timidly. Edward looked down at his buffers, pondering. "Well, that's more so speculation, Percy. Some say that every year, on the date of the accident, it runs again, not as a danger, as some believe, but as a warning to others. And some even claim to see him plunging into the gap like a lost soul. But how true that is, I can't really say," finished Edward. "Such a shame," said Percy sadly. "I would have liked to met this Timothy. He did sound like a nice engine." "Indeed," replied Edward softly. "If he did meet you, I have no doubt you would have made him feel welcome." Soon it was evening, and it was time to return home to Farquhar. Percy said goodbye to Edward and set off down the main line. When he arrived back at the branch line sheds, Percy told Thomas and Toby about Edward's story of Timothy. To Thomas's surprisingly shock, Timothy was actually his long-lost older brother from the days of Brighton. Eventually, the following day, while taking a goods train to the other end of the line, Percy arrived at the viaduct. It was its usual appearance, standing tall and proud above the river. What should be a highlight of the journey, though, now felt very unsettling. Percy peered down into the valley, a chill running in his boiler. He could picture it now, an engine out of control, leaping off the line, and just falling. He looked away and puffed safely across the viaduct, staying completely silent out of respect.